Well, in studio with me is Jon Carapiet, spokesperson from GE Free New Zealand, to discuss this issue. Jon, does that mean you're at GE, anti-GE?
Well, the organisation I'm spokesperson for is called GE Free New Zealand in Food and Environment, and that's an important distinction. What we're arguing is that you have to contain this technology, use it ethically in appropriate ways for New Zealand, but once you get outside of the lab or outside of containment, in nature, in the environment and in our food, there's a lot more issues, and we're saying that's not something we want to do at the moment.
But isn't genetic engineering a very, very small portion of that whole biomedical technology that we're talking about?
Absolutely. The whole of biotechnology presents issues of ethics and values for all countries, including New Zealand. But yes, GE is one side of that. It's got particular aspects about the way it's done. And of course, if it's a living organism in the open environment, living organisms spread. And that's one of the big issues. Of course, if you're developing medicine in a medical lab for an individual sick person to take, that's a different set of issues from forcing everybody's families and children to eat a GM product.
Aren't you scaremongering? For example, the DNA, the engineering of, modification of DNA, isn't it's sort of like driving a car and you hit a pebble, and, is that ripple effect so big that we have to worry about it?
Well, actually, the ripple effect's a really good image, because it's a very small stone that can cause a big ripple. And with genetic engineering and DNA, we're talking about very small changes that can have a massive impact. I mean, we know that, for example, when someone's DNA is damaged or you inherit a genetic disease, when they look for it, it's actually a very small change in someone's genetic code that can cause an illness. Now, scientists changing genes deliberately are facing the same issues. You can change things that you plan to change, but in the process you may change other things, and that can have a knock-on effect. So it's very much a ripple, and until we understand the effects of those ripples, what we're saying is it's unethical and immoral, and probably not in the public interest, to release GM organisms into the environment where they interact, where they can spread.
But bring it back to that medical sciences. I mean, when we're talking about gene technology, where we're actually treating diseases or genetic abnormalities, for example, with gene technology. I mean, isn't that a good thing, though?
Well, certainly what we're learning about disease through gene science is absolutely a good thing. And today, of course, we've got genetic engineering being used to create insulin, for example, for diabetics. But that's being made in containment inside a lab. It's not in the open environment. And I think that's the real difference. And of course, medicine itself is different because it's for an individual sick person rather than going into our food where everybody has to eat it or everyone has to live with it in the environment.
So if the research is actually done with a lot of controls, you're actually okay with it? So you're not anti-GE per se?
Well, I'm personally not against genetic engineering. I'm against the way it has been used and the way that big corporations are trying to make it be used.
For you to exist, that means we don't actually have a lot of guidelines in place in New Zealand, is that right?
We've actually had a 10-year battle to get guidelines put in place. Today, we do have actually some regulations in New Zealand, which is why we haven't got anything genetically engineered in terms of crops or food out in our commercial environment. They have been doing experiments, and of course a lot of the work is done in containment. Now, that's a debate to be had. There are certainly things going on in labs which I would think were unethical. But at the end of the day, I haven't got control over that. But the public, and I'm the voice for the public concern around GE, is concerned about when it's in the open environment or when it's in the food supply, and people have no choice to avoid it. Because, of course, the insurance companies won't cover the risks because it's so complex. And so when someone is forced to eat a GM product, they're sort of being forced to take on a risk that I would say is unethical. You shouldn't be forced to make your children into guinea pigs.
I'm against forcing people, but isn't genetic engineering all about, even in food, about better yields and, better crops?
Well, that's what some people would have us believe. I mean, there's two main kinds of crops that are made today that are genetically engineered around the world. Now, the best example to give you why it's a problem is a crop's designed to survive being sprayed by weed killers, a famous weed killer in New Zealand. All over the world, these crops are being sold, and they're planted, and they spray them with the weed killer, and only the weeds die. These plants do not die. But, of course, by being sprayed, they absorb those sprays. So you know that a lot of people are concerned about having cancer-causing chemicals in our food. This is actually increasing the amount of chemicals going onto food, and we eat it. So when they applied for these new types of crops, these GM crops, they also applied for a 200 times increase in the residue of these chemicals. Now that just doesn't make sense. So something that sounds like it's going to be better for the environment ends up increasing the chemicals in our food. So that's just not a good thing.
So let's talk about this. Have we in fact opened up a Pandora's box by introducing the research into genetic engineering in New Zealand?
We're not going to ever be able to uninvent genetic engineering or biotechnology. They exist, and they're going to continue to exist. What I think the challenge is to say, yes, we have opened a Pandora's box. There's a famous Chinese curse, may we live in interesting times. We do live in interesting times. The opportunity here is to use it ethically, with people's values, with human values in mind, but not go off and just say it's all about money, it's all about who can patent the genes that naturally existed for centuries, who can force farmers to grow them, who can force consumers to eat it against their will. That's the issue. And the Pandora's box really is when scientists and companies have got such power, how do we make sure they are moderated, regulated, and encouraged to use it ethically and against humanity's better interests?
Do you think we should be marketing this whole anti-GE stance to market New Zealand as a clean, green, GE-free country?
Well, and to some extent we are. On the eve of the government saying, OK, we're not going to release it, but we're going to allow people to apply to release GE organisms. Major companies like Heinz Watters, like Zespri, who are major exporters from New Zealand, asked them not to do this. They said Japan, Europe, markets all over the world do not want GE contamination in food, and so it's definitely an opportunity, and it's already being done. Companies, Goodman Fielder recently came out, and they're a very major company here in New Zealand and Australia, and they asked the Australian government to stop the release of a GE crop because it would contaminate their products, and the world doesn't want it. Ironically, I mean, New Zealand is actually not as clean and green as we should be. And I guess the question is, do we throw in the towel? Do we give up and say, look, let's make it into a sewer, just let anything go? Or do we stop and say, no, let's make it clean and green. Let's clean up our agriculture system so it's sustainable. Let's make sure that we export food that is clean, natural, GM-free, organic. And that's what the world is wanting. We can't compete with India and China on commodities that anyone can grow. But if we can make our food system clean and green, GE-free and natural, that is the opportunity that will always benefit our economy long into the future. And it does another thing. It respects people's values. I mean, I've talked to people, and I'm sure you'll talk to them on the street. I've talked to Indians who are Hindus. I've talked to Buddhists. I've talked to Muslims. All of these cultures have certain values around food. And the minute you start forcing people to eat food, which, you know, it may be a pig gene in a tomato, which is something that's actually been done, or rather it's a copy of a pig gene. But those sort of things someone is not going to want to have because they don't want to eat a pig gene.
Thank you, Jon, for joining us. Well, it's a topic we could discuss for days, but how do Asian Kiwis feel about the whole GE issue? We took to the streets to find out.